Hi, everybody, and welcome to our February edition of our webinar series. This month, we're talking about the neurobiology of trauma. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. Like always, I'd like to warn everybody that some of the content you're about to hear might be a little bit upsetting, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause the video if you need to. And also, I'd like to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory, and we also operate on Treaty 1 territory. And these are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and is also the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. So why is it important that we talk about the neurobiology of trauma? I know it's not something that is typically discussed when we talk about sexual violence and domestic violence, but I think that as you'll see through this presentation, trauma is often misunderstood as a phenomenon. How it affects the body and how it affects the brain is often misunderstood, and unfortunately, this can have negative effects on survivors of trauma. So, for example, a lack of information about the neurobiology of trauma can impede the ability for service professionals to do their best to assist survivors. So, whether that's in the healthcare context or the justice system context, having a misunderstanding about how trauma affects the body and the brain can really impede the ability for service professionals to assist survivors, and this can have those negative impacts that we're going to discuss further. Also, information is power. So just even understanding how trauma affects the body and the brain, whether you're a service professional or not, having that information is really valuable in the event that you have the opportunity to assist a survivor or encounter somebody who has experienced trauma. Having that understanding of how it affects your body and your brain can make it easier for you to help somebody in a way that is best for them and actually works with the neurobiology of trauma. Talking about this, we can also devise ways to better conduct interviews. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time focusing on how the neurobiology of trauma negatively, or a lack of information around the neurobiology of trauma rather, negatively affects survivors when they go to report to police. So we're going to also spend some time talking about how we can devise better ways to conduct interviews in ways that are sensitive to the neurobiology of trauma and in ways that are sensitive to a trauma-informed and survivor-centered approach to interviewing. And that would also allow for opportunities to minimize the trauma survivors often experience in reporting, especially in a police setting. And these are all things that hopefully can be aided by having a little bit of an understanding about the neurobiology of trauma. And I would also just like to preface this presentation with, I am by no means a biology expert. We're going to be discussing only really two main brain structures, and we're not going to be going into like hugely in depth into the science behind it, but just kind of a very base level understanding of how trauma affects the ways that memories are encoded and the ways that it affects how we process emotions and information. So, how does the neurobiology of trauma affect memories? Oftentimes, when somebody experiences a traumatic event, such as a sexual assault, and they go to report to the police, oftentimes what's found is the memories of the survivor are affected. So the presence of trauma can cause memories to be encoded in the brain differently. And during a trauma, hormones flood the bloodstream, an effect that can last up to 96 hours. And these hormones are part of what affects how memories are encoded in the brain. So this kind of change in the brain function caused by trauma can cause memory gaps, can cause the inability to process events without 2 full nights of sleep, and it can cause perceived inconsistencies in interviews if neurobiology of trauma is not taken into account. So a lot of times survivors will display behavior that's consistent with the neurobiology of trauma that makes sense if you understand how the neurobiology of trauma works, but is seemingly inconsistent with sexual assault and memory, how it is typically perceived by police. So survivors may report freezing or experiencing tonic immobility during an assault. They may report speaking politely to the assailant or contacting him post-assault, showing little emotion in the aftermath of an assault, dissociating, causing an inability to recall certain details or recall things in a chronological fashion. And these things make sense when we understand the neurobiology of trauma and how it affects how memories and emotions and information is processed. But for folks who are not familiar with the neurobiology of trauma, as unfortunately many in the justice system are not, these things can cause them to discredit survivors' accounts, can cause them to disbelieve survivors, and when in reality, there is scientific backing for these behaviors being a part of how the brain processes trauma and are completely normal. So, why does trauma affect memories during and post assault? So, when the brain detects the presence of trauma, as I mentioned, it floods the bloodstream with hormones whose only intent is to preserve the life of the person in danger. So, no matter what reaction somebody has to trauma, that was the brain's way of trying to preserve the life of the person who is in danger. And this happens because the ordinary processing system in the brain, so usually things come into the brain through the cortex, which is the top layer of the brain. So, yeah, the cortex is the top layer, and then it kind of works its way into the internal structures of the brain. However, during the presence of trauma or when the presence of danger is sensed by the brain, which often happens unconsciously, the brain's way of processing information is automatically altered, and the cortex is bypassed as the initial kind of way to process information, and events are filtered directly through the brain's unconscious defense mechanisms. So, in the amygdala, which is right here. And we're also going to be talking about the hippocampus. Those are the two main brain structures we're going to be covering. But we're going to start with the amygdala and the hormones that it releases and how that affects memories in the presence of trauma. So the hormones that are released can cause lapses in memory, an inability to recall events in chronological order, an inability to remember particular details. So for example, survivors might remember the color of the carpet in the room where the assault took place or what clothes were on the floor, but they may not be able to remember the perpetrator's face or how long the assault lasted for or the layout of the room, or what time of day that it happened at. And this is all a result of the hormones that are flooding the brain and the fact that the way that the brain processes information has been unconsciously altered to preserve the life of the person in danger. So having the way that the brain processes events and information be altered in this way significantly changes what your reactions are going to be and how memories of that particular event are going to be stored. So this is just a very basic model of the brain. Again, we're going to mainly be talking about the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the amygdala associates sensory experiences and emotions with implicit memories. So implicit memories are memories that operate below our level of consciousness to help our brain make like lightning fast snap decisions about the potential presence of threats or danger. So oftentimes the amygdala will sense the presence of danger and begin to initiate that response without you being consciously aware of it. And the hippocampus is involved in turning short-term memories into long-term memories. So what it does is it attaches sensory and temporal or time-based information to events. And then those memories are taken in the hippocampus and transferred from short-term memories into long-term memories. And that's how we remember things that happened to us long ago. So during a sexual assault, the function of the hippocampus is diminished, which leads to a reduced ability for us to transfer short-term memories into long-term memories. So for that reason, that is why survivors often have gaps in their memories, because the ability for their brain to transfer short-term memories into long-term memories is impeded. And again, that's a survival mechanism by the brain, trying to preserve the life of the person in danger by preventing the transfer of very traumatic short-term memories and sensory information into long-term memory, it's trying to reduce the amount of trauma that the person will experience long-term. However, the function of the amygdala is heightened. So that means that implicit memories of sensory information and danger are accelerated on that unconscious level. And that's why survivors oftentimes will have trouble remembering chronological events or what are called relevant details, but can remember fragments or sensations or feelings, things that are more unconscious and associated with that implicit memory that exists below our level of conscious awareness. So let's talk a little bit about trauma and the fight, flight, or freeze response. So initially, it was thought that there were only two possible responses to a traumatic situation, which was fight or flight. However, due to more recent studies that have been done on responses to trauma, especially in situations of sexual assault, we know that that's not true. There aren't just the two options for responding to trauma, and freezing is also a common response, and that's especially in situations of sexual assault. And freezing happens when there's a loss of what's called executive function ability, or the ability to consciously reason and make decisions in a typical or quote unquote rational manner. And that's because, like we talked about before, the way that the brain processes information is significantly altered once danger is sensed, and the prefrontal cortex, which is our conscious ability to reason and make decisions, is bypassed, and things start to be processed through the amygdala, which is where kind of implicit memory reigns supreme, and things are processed on an unconscious level based on cues from outside the body that indicate that trauma or danger may be present. And the loss of that executive function also affects the ability to chronologically sequence events. So that's, again, why survivors may recall things in fragments or kind of out of chronological order, or they may recall things in terms of sensation or emotion instead of the typical quote unquote way that memory operates when the hippocampus is able to transfer short-term memories into long-term memories without the presence of trauma. The fight, flight, or freeze response is important to talk about when we're talking specifically about sexual assault, for the reason that there are, as we've talked about in other webinars, the presence of what are called rape myths in society that dictate what is the quote-unquote proper response for somebody who has experienced sexual assault. And for a long time, the only two acceptable responses for somebody who had experienced sexual assault were either to fight off the attacker or to run away. So if somebody didn't do either of those things, then they were judged for that. There was prejudice associated with that, when in reality, freezing is a very common trauma response, and it doesn't mean that an assault didn't take place. And it doesn't mean that a lack of resistance doesn't mean that the person, was in quote unquote inviting the assault, as the myth goes. It's actually, due to the study of the neurobiology of trauma, been recognized as a very common response to trauma or danger. So just a little bit more on this freeze response, because I think it's really important to kind of dispel the myths surrounding it. The freeze response can result in dissociation, which means that the brain goes elsewhere, sort of. So in the presence of trauma or danger, the person's conscious thoughts will kind of, go somewhere else. Tonic immobility is also a freeze response, which is the complete inability to move. And collapsed immobility is also a common freeze response, which is a greatly reduced ability to move. And this happens in situations of extreme fear, where the brain perceives that the only response available to preserve life, because remember, that's what the brain is trying to do when it senses the presence of trauma or danger, the only response available is to remain still. And again, this is often a misunderstood response in relation to sexual assault. It's seen as a lack of resistance, and many use this response to try to diminish the credibility of survivors. And because of the way that society views the freeze response, survivors will sometimes internalize this narrative and feel guilty or ashamed that they froze and didn't fight back or run away, when this is a completely normal response that is entirely out of their control. So the neurobiology of trauma and victim blaming are related. A lot of the aspects of the neurobiology of trauma coincide with instances of victim blaming. So what I mean by that is normal reactions to trauma often conflict with how society thinks survivors of sexual violence should act. So while we know that the ability to recall events in chronological order is a normal effect of the neurobiology of trauma, it acts often contrary to how society thinks survivors should act or should be able to recall events in chronological order. So for example, if a survivor is unable to recall events in chronological order, or is only able to recall fragments of events, oftentimes they will be accused of fabricating the assaults, because if it really happened, then they would be able to recall events in chronological order. Whereas now we know, due to research into the neurobiology of trauma, that this inability to recall events in full or in chronological order is actually due to the ways that the processing of information is altered when the unconscious mind senses danger. Again, another normal reaction is the inability to recall particular details or focusing on seemingly quote unquote irrelevant details. Again, this is due to the fact that the way the brain processes information and senses and emotions, and the way that the brain stores memory, is significantly altered in the presence of danger. And while that is a normal reaction, we now know, to trauma and danger, oftentimes survivors are subjected to the ways that society thinks survivors of sexual violence should act. And society would say that, you know, if it really happened to you, you should be able to recall all of these details. And why are survivors focusing on things that are not relevant? It's because that is the way that the brain was built, to preserve the life of the person in danger. That is a completely normal response. And hopefully with more information coming out on the neurobiology of trauma and becoming kind of in the public realm, that myth will be dispelled. The activation of a fight, flight, or freeze response, as we just talked about, is a completely normal reaction to trauma or danger. But again, two of those responses, fight and flight, are privileged over the freeze response, when in reality, the freeze response is also completely normal for people to experience. So this lack of knowledge around the neurobiology of trauma, coupled with a social context in which victim blaming is common, often results in situations where survivors are not believed, their credibility is called into question, or investigations are undertaken improperly. And this is the reason why it is so important to talk about the neurobiology of trauma and help people to understand how it works, even on a very basic level like we are doing, so that these instances of victim blaming and these societal rape myths can work to be dispelled and survivors are able to get the proper care that they need. So how does this lack of information affect investigations specifically? So oftentimes, unfortunately, health and justice system actors are unaware of how the neurobiology of trauma affects recall and memory, and how particular types of questioning can trigger a stress response. So unfortunately, this results in situations where inappropriate questions are asked. There's In many situations, interviews often take place too soon after the assault. As I kind of mentioned at the beginning, experts suggest that it takes 2 full sleep cycles for the brain to properly integrate the memories and sensory information gleaned in a traumatic way, as those memories and senses and emotions are processed differently. It can take up to 2 full sleep cycles, and also the hormones that flood the body in the presence of trauma can take up to 96 hours to fully leave the person's system. So typical investigative techniques rely almost exclusively on chronological memory, or recalling things in a narrative in a chronological order. When this is not how traumatic memory is stored, as we've talked about. So investigations tend to prioritize this chronological memory when that's really not going to be useful when traumatic memory is often fragmented. Also, investigations tend to prioritize narrative memories rather than sensory emotional memories. So by narrative memories, I mean memories that follow a story. So this happened and then this did and then this. When in reality, we know from neurobiology of trauma research that when someone is exposed to trauma or danger, the ways that their memories are processed by the amygdala are in the sense of implicit memories, which rely on sensory and emotional information. So oftentimes, rather than survivors, rather than being able to say, this happened to me and then this and then this, in kind of that storytelling narrative, they'll be able to say, well, I felt this extreme fear, or I felt this, or I felt that. I felt really cold, or those kinds of things. And unfortunately, investigations tend to disregard that type of information. However, there are better ways to conduct interviews using neurobiology of trauma research. So having information on the neurobiology of trauma and disseminating it widely can mean that interviews with survivors can be undertaken in a much better way. So here are some examples of how that could happen. One, allowing survivors to have those full 2 sleep cycles before an interview takes place is really important, not only for making sure that the memories that were gleaned in that traumatic way are processed and integrated into the brain in the best way possible, but also making sure that the hormones that flood the body in the presence of danger are out of the system as much as possible, as that can really cause a lot of upset. Recognizing that sensory and episodic memory does not mean that there are gaps or inconsistencies in the survivor's story, but that's just how traumatic memory is processed. So again, one of these myths that exist in society is that if somebody can only recall bits and pieces, or if there's gaps in their story or inconsistencies in their story, then it must not have really happened, when that is not true at all, due to the way that the neurobiology of trauma works. That's just how traumatic memory is processed, and the thinking on that needs to start to change a little bit. Getting rid of interview tactics that are intended to confuse the interviewee. So a lot of times in interviews, survivors will be asked to recount the events multiple times from different points of time in the narrative. They might also be subjected to the investigator throwing in inaccurate information when questioning to see if the survivor immediately corrects it. They might be asked to recount the story multiple times just in general. And all of these things are intended to kind of confuse the interviewee and try to see if there are inconsistencies in their narrative. However, when somebody has been exposed to immense trauma, that is really a counterproductive way to conduct an interview. As we know, episodic memory is very common, so oftentimes there might not be a narrative memory or a chronological memory for them to recount, and that comes across as having gaps or inconsistencies, when, as we talked about, that's just how traumatic memory is processed. So when people don't know that, it results in a situation where survivors are disbelieved because the way that their brain is processing information doesn't fit with the way that typical information is processed. Again, not privileging a narrative of chronological memory over sensory, episodic, or emotional memory. Oftentimes, narrative chronological memory it doesn't even exist after somebody has experienced trauma, and the memories that they do have are more sensory, episodic, or emotional in nature. Taking a survivor-centered approach and going at their pace, taking breaks when needed, allowing somebody to have a support person with them, being consistent in the interactions survivors have with their interviewers is huge. So sticking with the same officer, the same room as far as possible makes it a lot easier for the interview to be conducted in a way that minimizes the trauma that somebody is experiencing when they're recounting these events. And finally, minimizing the number of times that a survivor will have to recount their story, because oftentimes survivors will have to recount their story to police multiple times. Perhaps they would also have to recount it to a lawyer, or they'd have to recount it in court. And this triggers emotional distress at levels that are comparable to that of the initial assault. So that really does a lot of harm when we're asking survivors to recount their experiences multiple times when that's not necessary. There are better ways to do that. So these are some of the sources that came to my mind when I thought of places people could go to learn more about the neurobiology of trauma. Again, because this presentation was focused on a very base level understanding of the neurobiology of trauma and just trying to dispel some of the more common myths that are wrapped up in the neurobiology of trauma research. So Lori Haskell and Rebecca Campbell are two academics that focus on the neurobiology of trauma, specifically related to sexual assault. Human Rights Watch has a report online available on improving police investigations of sexual assault. There are a few books I would recommend as well. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and Putting Trials on Trial by Elaine Craig. Also, What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey is a good one. And all of these deal with either trauma, how trauma affects the brain, or how sexual assault investigations and trials are not sensitive to the ways that trauma affects the brain. And finally, Klinic has a trauma-informed toolkit online that is excellent and really goes into a lot of detail on how trauma affects the brain and the ways that people remember things and the way that information is processed, specifically related to when people have experienced violence. That's what we've got for you today. So please feel free, of course, as anytime to contact us. Our information is just below. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us next month.